Shalom, welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabad House of Delmar, and today we're going to talk about the Jewish holiday of Passover. Passover is more the universal holiday for Jewish people. It's celebrated in the biggest percentages of any other holiday, even Hanukkah or the high holidays, so it's important to many people. And it's important to many people in other communities too. They hear about Passover. You see about Passover in almost every supermarket. There's Passover displays of matzahs, and people want to know what is the holiday. Well, we'll start with basic idea of what Passover is, and then we'll go into some deeper interpretations of what the deeper meanings of Passover is. Now, Passover started with 3,300 years ago, when the Jewish people were just a small group of people, 70 people, that's all the whole nation was, and this with Jacob, and he took his family to Egypt. Why did he go there? He was in Israel, but there was a famine, and obviously you don't want to starve to death in a famine. Better to live a life of prosperity in a foreign country than die in the Holy Land. So they moved to Egypt. In the meantime, that they were there, and they grew from 70 people, and a few hundred years later when they left Egypt, there was like 2 to 3 million people, so they really prospered there. It was really a lush land. I don't know if you look at Egypt today, if you can really understand what Egypt was 3,000 years ago. Maybe that's because all the 10 plagues, which we'll talk about, happened and destroyed the land for the most part, and it's never been the same since. But in the meantime, it was a flourishing land, and Joseph, who was a Jewish person and a great man, it was a tzaddik, a righteous man, he was actually number 2 behind the Pharaoh. And so therefore, the Jewish people really had it well off. But, as time goes on, Joseph passed away, and you call it in Jewish protexia, the protection went away also, and the Pharaoh decided to come down on the Jewish people. It's a theme that we see throughout Jewish history. Jewish people, for example, just one example, in Spain, the Jewish people prospered. They always actually called the golden era of Spanish Jewry. They prospered. Then, of course, in 1492 was the Spanish Inquisition. Either they were tortured, they were thrown out. So life has its ups and downs, or they call it the wave theory in Jewish history, or even in regular history, you have the rise and fall of empires. So the Jewish people, again, maybe we can say in even our last generation, Germany, the Jewish people had many rights in Germany. They prospered in Germany. And of course, we know then what happened was the Holocaust happened through the Nazis and devastated the Jewish population there. So this is what happened in Egypt also, that the Jewish people prospered, and then when it was going downhill, they were enslaved, that they had to build the pyramids, they were being tortured, and the Jewish people then cried out to the Almighty. Almighty heard their prayers and said, we're going to take the Jewish people out. He actually promised that to Jacob, that eventually they will get out, they wouldn't be slaves there for eternity, and that they actually were be led by Moshe or Moses. He was going to be the leader of the Jewish people. He was designated, he was a great person to lead the Jewish people. And they gave the Pharaoh the option. He told him, listen, either let the Jewish people go, because these are God's people, they have to go to the Holy Land, to Israel, or you're going to get punished. But God hardened his heart. He didn't want to go out. He was an evil person. He didn't want to let the Jewish people go to freedom, and he was punished, and his nation with the 10 plagues. So, interesting concept also, besides the basic story, was why that the Almighty hardened the Pharaoh's heart, even though that, let's say, he would have let them go out after 5 plagues, even without the hardening of the heart. Why did it's almost like, if you want to use an example, he tied his hands behind them and then he punished them. He said, let them go free. So this is a very big issue in Jewish philosophy, because we know that God is just and he is righteous, just doesn't like people to suffer. People may say that, but it's just not true. That it's a harsh world, I know, and there's a lot of tragedies in the world, but Not that the Almighty doesn't want to see people suffer. But so why did he have the Egyptians suffer then is the big question. And really that they deserved the punishment. They took Jewish people, they weren't their enemies, they helped them along like they do in every country. Jewish people don't undermine a country, they only are helpful to the country. So why are you harming them? Why you punish them? Go back again a generation to Germany. What did the Jewish people harm Germany? They prospered, they were Nobel Prize winners, they helped the country. Why are you so against them? Why are you so angry against the Jewish people? Well, the answer is that's pure evil, that's all. Someone goes against you and you want to defend yourself, fine, you're going to understand that person's not evil for fighting back. But if someone is innocent and just is your friend and all of a sudden you just push them and harm them, then that's pure evil. And that's why ultimately they deserve the punishment that they really came to them. In any case, that they did have the 10 plagues. We don't have the time to go through every detail of the story. Really, I can go for hours. And talking about the Seder, actually, that on Passover night, when there is the Seder, and we do eat the matzahs, you are supposed to talk about the story of the liberation of the Jewish people out of Egypt for the whole night as much as you can. It really does take a few hours. We don't have the time. Maybe in the future we talk about more details about it. So I'm just giving you the basic storyline and a few deeper interpretations. There were 10 plagues. The Jewish people also were delayed. And Moses says, well, the Jewish people said, let's go, let's get out of here already. Moses says, no, that we have to take the gold and silver. And it's interesting, the Gemara, the Talmud gives an interesting story. And it says that the Jewish people would rather leave out early. So why, it says that a person with a prisoner, if you would ask a prisoner, hey, I'll let you out right now, or I'll give you $1,000 or whatever, I'll give you some money if you stay here for another week or whatever, another month. A normal person would just say, I don't need the money, just let me out of here. I just want to get out as much as you can. It's interesting, and a side note, I always have my stories about everything. One of my 10 jobs, like I say, is prison visitation, and unfortunately there's Jewish inmates, and I do a service to them to visit them and talk to them about Torah. And this is obviously to better their lives and straighten out their lives. And one inmate once told me the story that he actually had the option of giving the money. It was like an insurance fraud business. They had the crime to give back the money, and he don't have to do any time in the jail. Or, if you don't give back the money, you're going to do time. He says, well, I could do the time in jail. That's what he told me. He told the judge, and I saw him, obviously, incarcerated in jail, in prison. So after he was there, obviously, he was there for a while, and I was visiting him. He says, this is exactly what the story is, I regret my choice. It says it's horrible being in jail and prison, and it's not worth any amount of money. Eventually got out, but again, that almost goes in line with the Gemara. I told him exactly what I'm telling you now. I tell what the Gemara says. That's not normal. A normal person would just rather be free and forget about the money. In any case, but Moses says you have to stay here for a while, because when we said Almighty told our forefathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, He told Abraham, your children will be a stranger in a strange land, meaning they'll be slaves in Egypt, but ultimately they'll come out with money. So he says, I don't want Abraham coming and arguing with me. Stranger in a strange land, meaning prisoners or slaves in Egypt, they were. That was fulfilled. But the money part wasn't fulfilled. So I just want to be sure the Jewish people come out with a lot of gold and silver. And there was incredible amount of gold and silver. It says because, first of all, there was a famine all over the world, and Egypt had grain, so a good commodity market. If you have the goods and everybody doesn't, you get the prices go up, and you get a lot of money. And in truth, Egypt was actually very rich from all the gold and silver that Joseph and the pharaohs accumulated. It's very interesting. Again, even I like history myself, but there's so many museums talking about the Egyptian Empire. I know you're in Albany, but really in the British Museum all over the world, there's these these Egyptian artifacts, and how great an empire really, really was in its heyday, thousands of years ago. But it was an incredible empire, and there was an incredible amount of money, and the Jewish people took it. Ultimately, the Jewish people took a lot of that gold and silver and used it to, number one, for a bad reason, to build the golden calf. But number two, they used it also for a good purpose, to build a tabernacle. If one reads the Bible or the Chumash, there you could actually notice that the menorah or different artifacts in the temple were made out of pure gold, and it took a lot of gold to build these different menorahs and the different utensils and vessels in the temple, in the Mishkan, the tabernacle. Eventually it went into the temple, eventually went to Jerusalem, but a lot of this gold and silver that they were used to build these tabernacle actually came from Egypt, so they needed it for a holy purpose. And again, I tell you another story, I look all my stories from the Talmud, that, we're talking about 3,300 years ago. Well, life goes on, and we're here today, but eventually the Jewish people 2,000 years ago, it's a big gap from 3,300 years ago to 2,000 years ago, but in any case, they were under the Romans, and just we all know basic world history. The Romans ruled the world, surely the Middle East, which was the known world at that time. So they tell a story. One person had an argument to the governor, the Roman governor in Egypt. It said the Jewish people owe us a lot of gold and silver, let's just say millions of dollars, whatever it was. Sure, it was worth more than that in today's standards. In any case, well, how did they owe you the gold and silver? Well, it says in their own Bible, it says that they took the money and took as a loan. They borrowed it, as the words, from the Egyptian. Well, listen, if you borrow something, you have to give it back. So it's time to give it back. Well, it wasn't a joke. I mean, it's just not a theoretical law case, because, like I just said, the Romans did rule that area, and if they decided, you owe the Egyptians money, then they would have to come up, and obviously they would be broke, to come up with that kind of money a few thousand years ago. So, but the Romans were a little bit fair enough. Then they said, well, the Jewish delegation, then please answer his arguments back. So they answered. He says, it goes like this. He says, you take slavery for 200 years. The Jewish people were in Egypt for 210 years. And again, we talk about not just a few maids or things. We're talking about millions of people, times their wages. I don't know what minimum wage then was, but they were builders and they were artisans, and they really did build up the pyramids. And that's, again, in today's standards, who knows, but obviously in anybody's standards, it was an incredible amount of labor and an incredible amount of wages. Let's add it all up, a few hundred years, and they didn't get paid. They were slaves, that they owe them a lot of money. And the Roman, the judge actually agreed with him. He says, they took the money, but look, and this is for lost wages for the last few hundred years. So he says the Jewish people are right. They had a right to the money, and that person had to leave town. Again, there were false charges against the Jewish people. In any case, different Roman justice than we have today. But again, that's what the justice, the Jewish people, many people do argue with me, and they just say, well, why is the Torah so mean to beat up the Egyptians? They took all their money away from them, and that's why I'm explaining why it was pure justice, that the Egyptian people did deserve that punishment, and the Jewish people in turn did deserve the gold and the silver, and they were eventually free. So even though I made it a long story very, very short, I wanted to get into, like I said, deeper interpretations. And we have to use a little bit of the Hebrew. The Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim means Hebrew, but again, all these rabbinical homiletics that they use that Hebrew word to be similar to another word. So Mitzrayim is Hebrew for Egypt, and also Meitzorim. Even if you don't know the Hebrew, it's very, very close. You can hear Mitzrayim, Meitzorim. Meitzorim means straits, contractions. So again, it says actually very interesting that even though it's a historical story and a beautiful story. And like I say, we relate it every year at the Passover Seder. So that's very beautiful on one hand. The other hand, that we have to make it relevant to ourselves. We're not living 3,300 years ago, and the Israeli state's for the most part is friendly with Egypt. We're not beating anybody up like that. We're not taking anybody's gold. So how is it relevant to us? And the answer to this would be that from this idea of Meitzoram, to be for restraint. In a certain sense, we are slaves. Of course, we aren't real slaves, thank God. But you can take it in an allegorical sense. Are we slaves to our emotions? You have to. Some people just, even the most basic thing, I have to eat, and they can't control themselves to be on a diet, and just even a most basic example. But what about deeper examples that people have their mindset that says, well, this is the way I think, and I'm not changing it. Well, in a way, you're a slave. Why can't you expand your mind? Again, it's expanding with freeing your mind to different ideas. How about your emotions, like saying you have your loves? This is what I like, and that's what it is. I don't like that person. I don't like this thing. Well, in a way, you're a slave. You're saying, well, I can't do anything about it. My hands are tied. This is the way I think. This is the way I feel. And I don't want to listen to anybody. And I don't want to change. So change is very scary. People don't like change. I know it's very difficult. Psychologists will tell that. I mean, again, people, even I give that basic example of diets. They say after a number of years, only 10% of people who even lost weight go back on their diets. It's very, very difficult to change. People don't want to change. We have very difficult issues like that. People even in trouble. I was even saying that people in prisons are in very, very desperate situations. So why don't you try something else? You're not happy. You know that it's wrong, or you're going down the wrong path in life. No, they just want to keep on going the same way. So change for everybody is very difficult. But in a certain sense, you could say that then you're enslaved. Then you're not doing the right thing, and you're not changing to do something better. In a certain sense, I mean, you don't call it maybe in normal English, you say he's stuck in the mud, but in a certain sense, that person's enslaved. So how do we get out of that enslavement? Then we have to have a higher authority. We have to have the Almighty. We have to have a Moses. We have to have a leader. A person should have a mentor to help them out. People cannot lift themselves up from their own bootstraps. It's very hard. So you have a friend, or like I say, a mentor or a teacher, to help them to come out and to go into a higher level and to break them out of their, so to speak, their little constraints that they're into, and to raise them to a higher level. That's one of the ideas from the Egyptian story. Another idea, we didn't talk about the 10 plagues, but one of the first one is the blood, that the Nile River was blood. The Nile River was obviously, it's a water source, so that would be an incredible makkah, or it's in Hebrew is a plague that hurt someone's water source, but he was more than that to the Egyptians, because they bowed down. They thought Nile River was a god. Well, again, because what is the idea of the Nile River? It overflowed the banks. It doesn't rain that much in Egypt. It overflows the banks. And then you have the water irrigate the fields. And again, remember this, and really it's really a good idea for the Bible also. They were very agricultural in those days. Now people live in big cities. But in those days, most people lived off the land, and therefore that was really what they were dependent on, the land, which needed water, which came from the Nile River. So they were always praying to the Nile River. Nile River, please overflow your banks. We need you. That's the only way we're going to eat, is if you overflow your banks. And please do that, and that's the source of our livelihood. This is very interesting also, that, again, what really is the source of your livelihood? Well, even scientists today saying you don't pray to the Nile River. Everybody knows that, because it's just natural. But ultimately, who's behind everything? And that's the Almighty. That is the source of everybody's livelihood. But sometimes you only see what's in front of your nose. You see the Nile River overflowing its banks. Again, we're not agriculturists for the most part. A few people are farmers, but most people aren't. And what is that? That's my boss, and I have to do whatever my boss says, because I got to make a living. And therefore, if I have to work on Shabbos or on the Saturday or the holidays, I just have to do it because that's the source of my livelihood. And or I have to go out and eat lunch with the guys because that's the way to do business, to be friendly with everybody, even if it's a non-kosher restaurant. And again, that is being, again, enslaved or worshiping to the source of livelihood is just what would be, even though we laugh, Egyptian, who's going to bow down to a Nile River or any river or do a rain dance for the rain clouds. We don't do that. That's ancient. We're sophisticated. But on the other hand, that in a certain sense we do that also, that you think the source of livelihood is right in front of our nose, and say there's someone controlling it. In the Talmud, the expression is you have to look. You're looking at the axe that chopped down the tree, meaning that the axe is just a tool. It's not the axe that chopped down the tree. Yes, it was the tool. You needed an axe, but the lumberjack who's behind the axe, that's who should give credence to. And the same thing for us. That really, it's not the Nile River, and it's not our boss. I mean, obviously you have to do a good job wherever you are, and be proper, and the boss should like your good work, but he's ultimately not the source of it. He's actually just a tool, and that you're really the Almighty is in charge of everything in the world. So that's one idea of the Nile River. Now, what did the Nile River turn into? Turn into blood. So why didn't it turn into orange juice? God could have dried it up. He could have done anything, be creative. It didn't have to turn into blood. And it's very interesting because what is blood? Blood is a life force. It's, my blood is boiling. It's an English term also. It's hot. Obviously, the person's alive. Their blood is flowing. So that's the first thing that a person has to change, that are people that understand that there's a lot of big things in the world, important, very exciting things in the world. But again, is that where a person's excitement should be? That a person has to gear, and like we talked about before, controlling their emotions, controlling their thoughts. Well, everybody's doing it, therefore I have to do it. That's the in thing. Well, not that it's necessarily bad either. On the other hand, there's innovations, new cameras, new things. Nothing wrong with that, but we have to determine with your mind, is that the proper thing that I should use my time for? Is that the proper place that I should be? And certain things are. There's nothing wrong. You don't have to shun yourself away from the world. We talk about that many times. On the other hand, that you have to just understand that certain things aren't proper, and that has to be determined through your Torah values. So that's another important aspect of Egypt. One idea is also, and to leave you with a very, very deep idea in the last few minutes, is that when was the last plague, we jump from the first to the last, again, we don't have that much time to talk about all of them, but was the plague of the firstborn. And now, say, all right, the firstborn were all dead, and that was the final hit before they said, just leave, this is impossible, we're dying, let alone we don't drink water, or we're having boils on our bodies. It's one thing, but obviously when people are dead, that's a whole different category. All right, just leave. So that was the final smack that had the Egyptians throw the Jewish people out of Egypt. On the other hand, when did it happen? So Moses told them at midnight, at stroke of midnight. So you say, well, what would make a difference when you're dead? You're dead. If it happens at 10 p.m. or 2 a.m., you're dead, you're dead. What does it really make a difference? He had to tell them when midnight is. That's very interesting because they were very mystical. They had astrologers that knew about the stars, and they trying to figure out astrology. It's really a subject in its own right that I talk about astrology and Judaism. But just to suffice it to say that midnight is at one point. It's when the night is divided, the middle point. But you could always divide that point. I mean, when's the geometry you were taught that it's the most essential point is the point. But if you can get one point, you can divide it and say, well, it's one of 1 millionth is the smallest point. Well, divide that in 2, divide it in 10. You can go smaller and smaller. Obviously, with dealing with numbers, it's infinitesimal. It's the smallest point. You can keep on dividing things putting another 0 afterwards, and you still have the smallest point. So what Moses, through God, was trying to tell them is that we're trying to get to the middle point, which no person can fathom. It's not in a human mind, because all we know is numbers. And like we say, you can always put another 0 afterwards, and it goes on forever. You can't say, I reached the furthest number that I can. Infinity is in God's realm. And that's what he wanted to tell them. And this is a major point, is just that we did talk about how the Egyptians were punished through the 10 plagues, and number 2, that their money was taken away from. But that's not the ultimate goal. It wasn't just to punish the Egyptians. The major point of the Passover story is that the nations of the world, the Egyptians, should realize there is a God in the world, not just to punish them, not just to kill them. That's not the issue. The issue is that they should realize there's one God, and that was the point of the 10th plague, the plague of the firstborn, that they realize that there's the 10th, that there's the infinity of God is really one. It's not the Nile River, and like again, you can go to these museums and see that they bow down to cats, and they bow down to this idol and that idol, and you can see that even today because they have these artifacts in the museum. It's not the cat, it's not the Nile River, it's not the sheep, it's not this, that, the other thing that they have. Ultimately, there's one God in the world, and that's what they had to realize, and hopefully they did ultimately realize that, even many people were dead. So just to sum up, we talked about the major idea of Passover story, which is the Exodus story. That is a commandment, it's a mitzvah to relate on the Passover night. So hopefully this makes your Passover a little bit more relevant, not just eating a piece of matzah, which of course is good and it's a mitzvah in its own right, but just to go through the Seder and the story and the Haggadah and make it more relevant to all of us, how not only is it an old-fashioned story 300 years ago, it's a beautiful story and nice traditions that everybody loves. Like I said at the beginning, everybody loves the Passover Seder. All Jewish people come to some Seder or one thing or another. They eat the matzah, their family and friends get together. That's all beautiful. But again, they have a little bit more deeper meaning in it, and to make it more relevant to all of us, that would make it even more of a deeper expression of really you feel what Passover is all about. So thank you very much.